1638. France just crowned a brand new king, who also happens to be 5 years old and named Louis. Fast forward 70 years and this kid grows into the most powerful king to ever France, and perhaps the definition of an absolute monarch. But right now his nobles aren't exactly thrilled that their boss still needs a bedtime story, so they drag the whole kingdom into not one but two chaotic uprisings known as the Frondes. You see, by the 1600s feudalism was dying, but it fought like a cornered animal. Either the crown crushed the nobles or the nobles crushed the crown. At 12, Louis learns that lesson literally in his bedroom. A mob storms in and he pretends to sleep until it's safe. His mother got the memo and whisked him out of Paris. Meanwhile, until he actually came of age, Louis was busy playing Apollo on stage, dressing up as the sun god in ballets while Cardinal Mazarin was trying to hold the kingdom together. Eventually, in 1651, Louis was declared fit to rule, and when Mazarin finally died in 1661, Louis dropped the training wheels. He announced that he would rule alone as Louis XIV, and people now should call him Le Roi Soleil, or the Sun King. From now on, every order, every decree, and even every letter to the Pope or letter from the Pope had to pass through him first. Louis had plans, not just to rule France, but to make everyone know who was the boss. And in true French fashion, he wanted it done with style. But style cost money, and France was broke. The 30 Years' War had drained the treasury, the Fronde uprisings had trampled what was left, and to make matters worse, the kingdom's finances were being run by Nicolas Fouquet, basically Littlefinger with a French accent. Fouquet had been in charge since 1653, and instead of fixing the mess, he built himself a shiny new palace at Vaux-le-Vicomte. Then, in 1661, he decided to throw the party of the century to impress Louis. Imagine fireworks, fountains, feasts, poets, musicians, Versailles before Versailles. But Louis wasn't dazzled, he was furious. The king looked around and said, "There's no way you paid for all this without dipping into my wallet." And just like that, Fouquet went from host of the year to prisoner for life. Louis had him arrested and locked away, while his palace and staff were conveniently repurposed for the crown. With Fouquet out of the picture, Louis decided he needed a palace of his own, one so dazzling it would make every noble in France both jealous and obedient. The answer was Versailles, because Louis figured that if his nobles were left alone in the halls of their own castles, they would do what they do best, plot against the king. But what if instead of letting them do that, you invited them to live in an epic palace and party 24/7? Nobles happily abandoned their states just for the privilege of living at Versailles, where they could rent a room and bask in the king's glow, provided they also danced to his tune. But life at Versailles was more than just fancy rooms and gold-plated furniture. Hundreds of nobles unable to plot against the king or run their own domains quickly got bored and invented the weirdest jobs imaginable. Every day, a carefully choreographed line of courtiers competed for the honor of helping Louis dress, holding his slippers, handing him his shirt, or even presenting his nightcap. Only in France could getting out of bed feel like a Broadway performance. Meals were equally theatrical. Dinner wasn't a private affair, it was a full-on performance, with the king on center stage and the courtiers as both audience and supporting cast. Every gesture, every toast, every crumb had to be perfectly timed, or risk offending the Sun King himself. Versailles had become a gilded cage, turning the French aristocracy into a theatrical joke. With his nobles under control, Louis could finally unleash his ambitions on Europe. He didn't just spark, he had bite. He built the largest professional army Europe had ever seen, 400,000 men at its peak. Of course, Louis couldn't do this alone. Louvois, his Secretary of State for War, masterminded the army's structure and logistics. Colbert stabilized the economy to fund all those uniforms, cannons, and marching shoes. And Marquis de Vauban fortified France's borders so no one could even think about attacking without a PhD in siege warfare. But before the battles start, let's talk politics. France had two main rivals on the board, England and the Habsburgs. England, though, was too busy tearing itself apart with civil wars and religious chaos, so Louis could ignore them for now. But the Habsburgs, oh, the Lannisters of Europe. Thanks to some very questionable family tree acrobatics, they had become both the kings of Spain and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. In other words, they basically sandwiched France from two sides, and Louis wasn't about to let his kingdom get squeezed like that. But luckily for Louis, the Habsburg Empire wasn't one neat package under a single ruler. It was a messy family buffet, so Louis set his sights on the Spanish branch, starting with their Dutch territories. His excuse? Well, he had married the Spanish king's daughter, and nothing screams romance like using your in-laws as a legal pretext for war. The war dragged on for a year, and Louis grabbed a handful of border towns. But that wasn't enough. Louis had beef with the Dutch Republic, because they were Protestant, rich, and just next door. So he's back at it once again in 1672, this time way bigger and louder. The Habsburgs joined to help the Dutch, and Louis literally bought himself an ally by shoveling mountains of gold at England. At one point in the war, the Dutch were so desperate they opened their dikes and drowned their own land just to stop Louis's advance, turning half the country into a swampy moat. And while Louis suffered a crushing blow with the death of his greatest general, Turenne, the Sun King still managed to claw his way to victory. But suddenly a major event completely shifted the balance of power in Europe. You see, Louis hardbanking the Netherlands made the Dutch Republic look incompetent and weak. This gave the pro-prince faction the perfect opening to unite behind the Protestant champion, William of Orange, who happened to be the son-in-law of the King of England. Now, when people in England see how their king is showing Catholic sympathies, they quickly call on William to invade England. So William, now having more supporters than ever, rolls in with his Protestant Dutch army, kicks the Catholic monarch out of England, and just like that becomes the ruler of both the Netherlands and England. Obviously, this is not good for Catholic Louis. The previous Stuart kings of England were far more in favor of Catholicism, with the ousted James II being removed precisely for being a Catholic. So now William had every reason imaginable, personal, national, and religious, to make Louis's life miserable. The war dragged on for 9 years, starting in 1688, as a grand alliance united to finally check Louis's expansionist policies and his religious crackdowns. The French won some important battles, yet they lost the war and had to return some provinces. Peace wasn't long though, because the Habsburgs, ever dramatic in death, gave Louis and all of Europe another reason to go at it once again. You see, Charles II, the Habsburg king of Spain, was famously sickly, so much so that one historian dryly notes, from the day of his birth, they were waiting for his death. And unsurprisingly, he finally kicked the bucket in 1700 at the tender age of 38. And brace for this one, he didn't have a child at all. So the next in line was either Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou, or a 6-year-old Habsburg named Joseph Ferdinand. But poor Joseph died before anyone could decide, and suddenly Europe was collectively panicking. While Louis was busy prepping his grandson for the Spanish throne, his enemies once again banded together to stop him. 13 years of cannon fire, sieges, and diplomatic chaos later, Louis managed to secure Spain for Philip. But Spain had to give its Dutch and Italian territories to Austria. And then Louis died a year later, having reigned like the sun itself over the turbulent sky of European politics for over 70 years. The Sun King burned hotter and longer than anyone else in European history. And maybe that's exactly how we wanted it.